You're listening to Today at Museum of the Bible with Chief Curatorial Officer Dr. Jeff Kloa. These exclusive conversations with authors, scholars, and leaders visiting the museum focus on how they are currently engaging with the Bible in their lives and work.
Welcome to The Bible Unfiltered, exploring the history and impact of the Bible with Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. I'm Charlotte Clay with Dr. Jeff Kloa, Chief Curatorial Officer of Museum of the Bible. Today, we're recording from Yeshiva University in New York City.
We're here with Professor Stephen Fine, who is the Director of the Center for Israel Studies here at Yeshiva University, an expert in the history of Judaism, especially ancient Judaism, and the lead curator of an exhibition currently at Museum of the Bible called The Samaritans, a Biblical People. Stephen, thanks for having us here.
Oh, I'm so happy. Welcome to Yeshiva University, guys.
Thank you so much.
My first time on campus, so looking forward to the tour later on.
Cool.
So, Stephen, why did you do and plan an exhibition on the Samaritans?
Samaritans are interesting. That's number one.
Okay.
And no one knew anything about them. I'd walk around and mention Samaritans to students, mention Samaritans to people on the street, and they'd say, oh yeah, the Good Samaritan.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Or, oh, those awful people from the Talmud. And
Right.
no one would know exactly what was going on, but I knew because I befriended members of the community relatively young when I was a BA student. And I knew these people as people and friends, and understood that here we had a living, growing, becoming community that we all thought were dead, right? You go out, Mark Twain called them like fossils. They're not fossils, they're people. And from an academic standpoint, it was super important to me to pull the Samaritans more closely into the conversation on what the first centuries were like, the time of Jesus, the time of Hillel, the time of the Talmud, as sort of a threesome with the Jesus communities and the Jewish community, the Judeans, that's us.
It's really a tri-faith story.
It's super a tri-faith story, or a three-community story.
Yeah.
And on top of all of that, what's become clear to me as we've been doing this project, as it's been growing, as it's become the documentary and the exhibition and the book, was how important it is to have this conversation in public together as people who have different worlds, different constituencies.
Yeah.
So that the world can see that we all work together on a regular basis, and that agreeing on 95% is enough.
You don't need 100.
You don't have to agree on everything. And so the Samaritans and Jews don't agree on everything. Samaritans and various Christians don't agree. And certainly all the Christians don't agree on everything.
Right,
and
right.
so, within our communities, we know how to deal with this kind of diversity. The question is what we can learn from this little tiny group, which can fill, 2 747s. That can help us to understand ourselves better. What I didn't understand quite so clearly when we started was how this was going to become a social movement. The study of Samaritans, the talking about Samaritans, the relations people have after they come to the exhibition or read the book or watch the documentary. But why the three of them? Because I wanted a bang.
Well, how many Samaritans are there today? Let's start with that.
Oh, today, maybe 851 if a baby was born this week. Okay. So there are around 850.
It says 850 on the label, so that has to be what it is.
That's
right?
it.
That's
It's
it.
the problem is people die, people are born. But remember that at the turn of the 20th century, it was less than 150.
Right.
And so for a micro people, this is amazing growth. The Bible says that the people of Israel are the smallest of all the peoples, right? Now, if the Jews are the smallest of all the peoples, then the smallest of all the peoples, that's the Samaritans.
Wow, that's a fascinating way to look at it. Yeah. Why was the population down to the 100s in 100 years ago? And how did it recover?
Oh, this is a great question. The Samaritans weren't liked by anyone for a good 2,000 years. The Hasmoneans destroyed their sacred space on Mount Gerizim, which is their holy mountain.
Yeah.
A beautiful excavation has shown what used to be there, right? The ensuing centuries led to Byzantine Christianity, which didn't like them any better, and destroyed their spaces as well.
Why were they disliked by the Byzantine Christians?
For the same reason that they were disliked by everybody. They
Yeah.
didn't fit into anyone's categories.
Yeah,
Right? Then Muslims came, and it's really great that Christians and Jews are the people of the book, and so they get to be second-class citizens and not be bothered.
Right.
But, if you were pagan, it wasn't such a good thing to live under Islam.
Right.
And what are the Samaritans?
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And so the pressures on this community. Now, I'm convinced that if the Samaritans had been the larger community, they would have behaved like everyone else. It's not like, they were the great, righteous, whatever.
Right.
But their community became the one.
They were the marginalized community.
They were the marginal of the marginal. They were like the Yazidi are today.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
They were this little tiny Near Eastern community. And most importantly, the Muslims didn't know what to do with them. And so in the 1840s, a radical group in Nablus decided that they weren't really dhimmi. Now, the Samaritans had spent 1,000 years trying to prove to the world that they were.
Right.
Right? They wrote a whole history to prove that Muhammad had given them a compact that would allow them to be acceptable members of the world, right? What happened? They said to them, you need to convert to Islam now, or die. Now, let me explain that 100 years earlier, they'd said more or less the same thing to the Samaritans in Damascus, and their community was decimated. And so small numbers came to Mount Gerizim. The community in Egypt, which wasn't attacked but declined, their people came to Mount Gerizim. We know that both from local storytelling, but also because artifacts from those communities found their way to Mount Gerizim. Right? And so they weren't lacking in experience in this process. Now, if you go to the area of Nablus, a lot of people out there will remember having Samaritan ancestors.
Wow.
And so this community has been pushed and pushed and pushed. The only reason they survived that event was that a British consul named Finn, James Finn, he took a liking to them and did a number of things that were helpful. Now, I don't know, I can't exactly connect the dots, but somebody got to the chief rabbi of Jerusalem, the Chacham Bashi, and got him to write a letter that said, the Samaritans are Israelites who believe in the Torah. Okay?
Literally.
That was enough to get the Turks off their back, which not surprisingly was the beginning of a rapprochement that continued right through the end of the 19th century, when another group of English speakers, American Protestant group, came in and started funding schools, or a school, and providing help for the community. But the moment of transition was the beginning of the 20th century, when Zionists took an interest. Why? Because coming back to their land, these Jews said, oh, these are Israelites who never left. Now, the truth is, it's not exactly that they never left. They came in and out like everybody else, right? And they had communities once in places like Gaza and Tulkarem and Jaffa. But, the myth became that they had never left the land, and these were the Israelites who stayed behind. Now, if you speak Hebrew, you hardly ever hear Jewish people referred to as Jews, right? It's always in the Bible and then in later sources,
Right.
B'nai Yisrael.
Right.
So if the children of Israel are the tribes of Judah and Levi and maybe some Benjamin,
Right.
then there's those other tribes of Israel. It's much easier semantically to put them all together
Right. Right.
as a single group. And so beginning with a fellow named Moses Gaster, who was the chief rabbi of the Sephardim in London, who was a folklorist, Zionists started talking and collecting, and they did something that had never been done before. They looked at the Samaritans straight in the eye, and they said, hello, we're relatives.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? If that hadn't been done, the Christians always had in their back pocket, well, maybe they'll become Christians someday. Right?
Sure.
It's natural. Right? The Muslims, well, they didn't really want to deal with them. And Jews before this period, except for Windows, when this wasn't the case, didn't want to deal with them either. Right? So in the 2nd, 3rd century, there were good relations. In medieval Egypt, they were all part of the same community, as they were in Damascus. But as a general kind of, relationship thing, there wasn't, kissing cousins.
Right. Right. Because there was that fundamental difference,
Yes, which is...
the Mount Gerizim. Well, maybe you could speak to that a bit.
Well,
Yes.
we'll do it together.
Yes.
Now, the Samaritans believe in the Torah of Moses. They don't have the rest of the Hebrew Bible.
Right.
Right.
That's the first thing, right? They don't have Joshua. They don't have any of those books that come after Joshua.
They don't have the Psalms.
They don't have the
Yeah.
Psalms,
Right.
prophets, none of it. And they have a slightly different version of the Torah than Jews do, or than Christians do
Right.
when translated. But it's similar to versions that existed during the Second Temple period. In other words, there were a lot of versions floating around during the Second Temple period, during the first centuries BCE. And they have one of them, except that theirs has a number of peculiarities.
Right.
The first one is, and you will sacrifice on Mount Gerizim to the Lord your God as the 10th commandment.
Yeah.
Wow.
Every community renumbers the 10 commandments a little,
Oh,
right?
interesting.
Yeah.
In
All the
order of
different communities.
importance?
No.
just slightly different reorderings. Catholics have one order, Protestants, Calvinists, right? It's
Absolutely.
different numbers, yeah.
And then the question is, I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt, one of them,
Yeah.
or isn't it?
Right.
Right? So for Jews, it obviously is.
Right,
Right?
right.
For Samaritans, it obviously is. So
Yeah.
things get pushed around in these 10 utterances so each community can reflect itself in it. Well, the Samaritans have the whole paragraph added in their Torah scroll, right?
Yeah.
And the other piece is when you get to Deuteronomy, where it says the place that the Lord shall choose in
Yeah,
Christian
right.
version or a Jewish version, not in the Samaritan. Because the place has already been
chosen.
chosen. Because that's where Abraham went. That's where the tribes yelled at each other across the
Wow.
valley, right? The blessings and the curses. And so that may sound like a small difference to people who are not part of one of these religious communities. But choosing the wrong mountain matters,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And everything that comes with that. The other piece is that Samaritans are sort of the mirror image sometimes of Jews. One of my students said it's like going to a fun house and seeing yourself in a mirror, but not really a mirror.
Right.
My son says that it's a mirror universe, though
Parallel universe.
a parallel universe.
Yeah.
And
Sliding
that's
doors.
true, because what's so fascinating for people who study the Samaritans is that it looks like Judaism. It feels like Judaism.
Right.
They have synagogues. They have food laws. They have Sabbath laws.
Right,
Right?
right.
They have holidays.
Right.
What about the dress?
Sukkah, yeah.
How does
On Tuesday, they dress like everybody else. On
Okay.
Saturdays, they dress like people who come from the Islamic world.
Yeah, interesting.
Or on holidays. And so they have, the fez and the whole business, which is dress clothes if you come
Sure.
from the Ottoman Empire.
Sure.
And so this sort of mirror parallel universe looks the same, and then you say, oh, that's different. And that's either a thing to celebrate
Right.
as the 5% that people can't always agree on,
Right.
or to fight about.
What was interesting to me about the exhibit is it took the approach of telling the Samaritan story from the perspective of the Samaritans, and not from a Western sort of historical critical approach, or, we know better than you guys kind of a thing. So things like, where's Mount Moriah, right? The sacrifice or the binding of Isaac. Let them tell the story their way, right?
Because as you know, the binding of Isaac took place on Mount Gerizim.
Well, in the Samaritan tradition, right?
That's
and
it.
of course in the Jewish tradition on Mount Zion, right? So just these subtle differences, and the whole issue of the exile, right? How were they connected to that? How were they a part of that? Were they taken away? Were they so this entire different version of the story, I think was a very interesting move, and helped see how they view themselves, right? How they've defined themselves and maintained their identity for these 2,000 years, or more than 2,000 years. One
of the things that our curatorial team made a decision about, right? Our Jesse Abelman, Rena Opert, and all of us.
Yeah.
One of the things that we made a decision on, as Jeff knows, is that we were going to look the Samaritans straight in the eye.
Yeah.
Everybody has a name.
Yeah.
The last thing we wanted to do was be colonial. The
Yeah.
last thing we wanted to do was tell them they were wrong.
Right.
That's not our job. Our
Right.
job is to give expression to who these people are,
Yeah.
in a way that people who would never have that experience could experience. Now it's not that we stayed away from those issues, because if you go left, you go into how Samaritans explain Samaritans. If you go right, you get into how Jews and Christians and Muslims explain Samaritans.
Right.
And they're all
But
different.
never the twain will meet
Yeah.
until it meets in the 19th century, where the Samaritan community and Western communities start talking to each other and testing things out together. But it's super important that if you see a mother and a child, that the mother and the child are not Samaritan mother and child, right? That they're
Mother and child.
They're
you know,
named.
they're people.
Yeah, yeah, and people who live today, rather than so many people think that this was a biblical people only.
It is so hard to explain to people that there are good Samaritans and bad Samaritans, and in between Samaritans,
Yes.
and Samaritans who work for DHL, and Samaritans who are teachers, and Samaritans who are lawyers, and people who have a
Right.
hummus factory, and on and on and on.
Right.
It's hard for folks who are used to, that guy who helped the person going up the hill to Jerusalem,
Yes, yes.
Right.
to be part of a larger group.
Yeah, yeah. Jeff, can you tell us the story of the Good Samaritan to give us that context for especially how a lot of Christians view Samaritans in that lens?
Well, the parable in Luke 10 is the place that name comes from, right? The parable of the Good Samaritan, and it's a story about a man who is on his way down from Jerusalem to Jericho, met by robbers, left half dead. Great word in Greek, hemathanatos, one of my favorite words. Not sure exactly what that means, but he's half dead, so he has no identity. He can't talk. He has no clothes. He can't be labeled as from a certain social group, a friend or not. And in the parable, you have a priest and a Levite walks by, passes by on the other side, and then the Samaritan comes by, sees, and does all these things. He comes to him, binds his wounds, puts him on his donkey, takes him down to the inn, the pub, maybe is a better translation, pays some money to make sure that the man is cared for, and importantly says he's going to come back to make sure that he's not just robbed again, but kind of goes not only the first mile, but the second and third and fourth mile. And Jesus in the parable uses him as an example of someone who actually follows Torah, that lives it out as it is commanded, right? Love your neighbor as yourself.
And those who passed by, right, that were priests and didn't help.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So it's there's a lot of dynamics going on
Yeah.
here. Why a Samaritan? Why a priest and a Levite?
Yeah.
What's the function of the Samaritan in that parable?
Especially since if you were listening to that story in the first century,
Right.
you'd think, well, the priest is the exalted one,
Yeah, yeah.
right? And the Levite as well. And then the Samaritan. There's
Right.
only one good Samaritan is probably how they would look at it.
Right.
Right? And this is like, there was a rivalry in the first century.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
And that rivalry was not a happy rivalry. There are stories of Samaritans planting pig bones in the temple,
Right.
right? So that the Jews
Wow.
couldn't play around in there, right? Couldn't do the sacrifice stuff.
Yeah.
There are stories of Samaritans messing up the communication of calendrical information, so people would know when the holidays were.
Wow.
You know, there are all
and
these
of course,
stories.
as you mentioned, the Hasmoneans destroying the worship site in Gerizim. So it's back and forth, right?
It's really not a happy relationship, but we don't have a lot of what Samaritans had to say about it. In fact, we have nothing.
nothing, right.
Except when they do eventually write about this period, they sort of make a point in their chronicle of saying, and in this year, Jesus of Nazareth was killed. And it was done by the Jews, not us.
Right, right.
So we have the exhibition till March 16th, so not much time left to see
April
it.
16th.
Oh, April 16th.
It's been extended. Just
I should
yes.
know that. That's kind of my department. Anyway, so what should people go see that they won't get from the book or the documentary or the cookbook? What about the physical exhibit is kind of a must-see from your perspective?
So many
Let me
things.
start out. I believe in exhibition as a form of interpretation and communication deeply. And there are things you can do in exhibition that you cannot do on a flat screen and that you can't do on a page that turns. And what is that? Immersion. You can immerse in even archaeological objects. You can
Right.
immerse in the Samaritan tabernacle, the Sukkah. You can walk into the Passover sacrifice. You can sort of feel the people that we're talking about. And happily, we made, for the same person who made our film, Moshe Alafi, 6 videos where you can walk in and the rocks are no longer rocks and the books are no longer books and the photographs are not just photographs, but the videos put it all together so that you can feel the human beings touching the books
Right.
and living in the buildings
Yeah.
and sacrificing the Passover and all this amazing closeness that's possible. And then you walk over and say, oh, that's Najach on the wall. And then Najach's talking to you on the screen.
Yeah.
And then you walk into the Passover sacrifice, and there's Najach sacrificing
the
the,
same
animal.
people.
Now, who's Najak?
Najach
for you, the
is
listener?
I just chose a name.
Yeah, okay.
But Najach is the cantor of the community.
Yeah.
An amazingly good and interesting
Yeah,
person
yeah.
who's one of the stars of our film, but his shows up all the way through the exhibition.
Well, there's only 850 of them, so odds are he's going to be in there.
Yeah.
Right?
Especially among the leadership.
Right,
exactly, yeah.
And so the sense that by coming into the exhibition, you can come out with your ears understanding more because of the different sounds that you've heard and your eyes understanding
Yeah.
more and in 3D. And it's very nice to see this stuff on a screen. But I can tell you, teaching my students, when I walk into class with a real live first century oil lamp and say, here, take this,
Right.
it changes everything.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
that's what the exhibition does, I hope,
If
for
you
everyone who
can't visit,
comes.
Yeah. Because not everyone, I know you visited, you actually visited the Samaritan community.
Oh, lots of times.
Lots of times, but most people won't get the chance.
Even
But-
if you
yeah.
do, you're not going to get through the front
Yeah.
doors.
Right,
Right.
right.
Right? Here you're walking into someone's living room.
Yeah.
That's a completely different experience.
Yeah.
Now, when you go up there on your next trip to Israel, you'll go and say, oh, yeah, I saw that, and I saw that, and I saw that. And I understand that, and that's the important part. And I heard that. And I keep stressing sound and sight and touch because that's what you can do in the exhibition. Now, if you go under our tabernacle...
Don't touch the stuff, please. But anyway, keep going.
I knew you'd say that.
But sometimes, you know,
But you know what? It's still, you can get so close to the materials.
Right.
You can see the wrinkles in the books.
things that are not behind a glass, but that are ancient is fantastic, such as the
The mosaics.
yes.
Well, my
yes.
favorite spot in the exhibit, when you walk in and you got the intro panel, but you turn left and you have a floor, a mosaic tile floor from a 5th century synagogue, Samaritan synagogue. You've got the 6th century door lintel, which has the famous 10th commandment about Mount Gerizim. You've got the 12th century Torah scroll Samaritan Torah scroll.
Which belongs to the Museum of the Bible.
Which is Museum of the Bibles, right? And then you've got the video of the community talking about passing on the traditions of the Torah, copying, the chanting. So you've got it all right there. You've got basically 1,500 years right in that one little section, and it's this multi-layer, multi-sensory experience. It's an amazing spot.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the piece of paper that we went into the trash in the synagogue that says Sabbath starts at such and such a time, and they print those out every week. Yeah. And of course, at the Museum of the Bible, we put it in a frame.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
In other words, it's in
now
the case,
it's art.
but it creates that sense that, again,
living,
modern. Little kids that we have pictures go in the synagogue on on the Sabbath or the holidays, eat their popsicles.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Normal.
Yeah.
Except they're wearing, of course, their Turk suits.
Right.
So, Stephen, this is fantastic, and congratulations again on this multi-year project, multi-dimensional project. Mm-hmm. Really cool. One takeaway you wish people would get from this whole project?
The first one that is important to me is that the three of us are sitting here having this conversation, that we did this project together from the first day in every possible way, with a level of unanimity and kindness that doesn't happen in every project. So that's we're at the Museum of the Bible, and that's really important for me to say.
Yeah.
The next thing.
Actually, we're at Yeshiva University, but
that
anyway,
shows it, right?
Yeah, it's true. But we're on my campus now, right?
Yeah,
that says it all. Yeah. Now, next piece. At Samaritans are human beings. That studying them provides us with another passage for understanding ourselves, for being kind to them, teaches us how to be kind to everyone else, right? That good Samaritan on the road didn't know who was dying.
Right.
He just helped him.
Right.
It's an astonishing story of loving your neighbor as yourself. It's one thing to say, oh, yeah, there's a Good Samaritan law and there's a Good Samaritan hospital.
Yeah.
But it's so much deeper to say, and these are their manuscripts, and they've existed for a long time, and they're interesting. And most of all, they're human, just like us.
Right. Yeah, maybe there was actually a guy who helped somebody by the side of the road, right?
Yeah, a real live guy that we should
People
emulate.
do it every day, and we should all, emulate it.
I've got to tell you a story. I was walking into my campus one day, just recently, with one of my students who'd been through the Samaritan course. And there was this old man who walked up and was exhausted. And he said, "Where's the subway?" I said, "1 block that way." And he looked at me, and he sighed. And I looked at him and said, "Are you okay?" "Yeah, but it's a long way." I looked at the student who was late for class.
Yeah.
And I said, "Okay?" She said, "Sure. Take my umbrella." And off she was to the subway with this guy.
Oh, yeah.
She came back and she said to me, I learned something, didn't I, Professor Fine?
Yeah.
Nice story.
Yeah, really nice.
That parable plays itself out every day, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, great. Stephen, thanks for the invitation to be here today. Thanks for your work on the exhibit.
Thank you so much.
And thank you, guys. Until next time.
Until next time.
Thank you for listening to Today at Museum of the Bible. Join us again to hear how authors, scholars, and leaders are engaging with the Bible every day. Only on Today at Museum of the Bible.